How much do our fears shape who we ultimately become? How much do our fears shape who we ultimately become? In 25 years as a war and investigative journalist, I've seen fear take over people's lives. I've seen fear take over communities. I've seen fear take over neighborhoods, even nations. Years ago, when engineers in Japan realized they needed to build a storm wall to protect Fukushima's nuclear reactors from natural disasters, they issued a report. But the bosses ignored that report. The engineers were too afraid to challenge their bosses, so they never went public with their findings. Then came the massive tsunami in 2011. The waves destroyed entire communities along the northeast coast. Fukushima's nuclear reactors were quickly overwhelmed by these waves, leading to one of the worst nuclear meltdowns we've ever seen. All because these engineers were afraid to challenge their bosses. On the flip side of fear, I've met those like Brian Clark, a 54-year-old businessman who was one of the only survivors when a jetliner crashed into his office in the Twin Towers in New York on September 11th. But rather than give in to his fear, rather than seek self-preservation, he answered the call for help from someone trapped in the rubble. He waded through smoke, burning fire, burning rubble to reach this injured man, and then helped carry him down 81 floors out of the building just moments before the Twin Towers collapsed. Through these people, I started asking, what does it take for us to face our fears? What does it take for us to summon the courage to be better versions of ourselves? I've spent a lot of time as a war correspondent in Afghanistan. And on one of those trips, I had a really personal encounter with fear. I was embedded with Canadian troops. We had just finished a mission, and a convoy had come to take us back to the main base. The only issue was, to get to the main base, we had to go through Suicide Alley, which was, at the time, one of the most dangerous stretches of road in the world. When the convoy turned onto Suicide Alley, everyone was tense. It was a 1-kilometer stretch of danger. The gunner beside me was scanning left and right with his 50 cal beside me in the armored vehicle. 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. Everyone was tense. 700 meters, 800 meters, 900 meters. In my hand, I had a handy cam, and I was recording just in case we came under attack, because it happened often. But at 900 meters, everyone began to breathe easy, thinking we were clear. But just at that moment, I heard my gunner yell into his comms, saying, "Watch the minivan to the left." I peered through the thick 2.5-inch glass of our armored vehicle and saw a vehicle idling on the side of the road. Then I noticed that the springs in the back were weighted down. I knew at that moment that that vehicle was laden with explosives. My gunner realized that as well and tried to swing his 50 cal gun to take out the driver, but it was too late. The driver stepped on the gas, accelerated, and went right into our convoy and went right into the vehicle in front of us and detonated. The blast threw us all back in our seats. Thousands of pieces of shrapnel flew everywhere. A huge plume of smoke went up in the air. People in my vehicle yelled, "Drive, drive, drive!" And we drove through the smoke past one of the convoy vehicles that was hit. I saw 2 Canadian soldiers fall out in flames. Moments later, they turned back around to try to form a cordon to protect the vehicle that had been attacked. All the soldiers got out, grabbed their machine guns, and went out of the armored vehicle. But I was stuck in my seat. I remember looking down at my hands, and they were shaking. I was afraid. I was paralyzed by fear because I knew that if it had just been a few seconds later, that suicide bomber would have smashed into our vehicle. And even though we were armored, there's no guarantee we would have survived. This was a crossroads for me. I knew that either I summon the courage, get up and get out of that vehicle and report, or I give in to my fear and eventually call it quits as a war correspondent. Sometime in our lives, we all face situations like this, where we're overwhelmed by fear, even paralyzed by it, and it stops us from doing what we are supposed to do. Maybe it's a horrible boss who you need to report on his or her abusive behavior, but are afraid to do so because you're afraid of losing your job. Maybe it's your child who's afraid to speak out about a schoolyard bully. Maybe it's a gang that's moved into your neighborhood and is starting to sell drugs in your building, but you're too afraid to confront them or call the police on them. Fear. How much do our fears shape who we ultimately become? Jack Canfield, the author of the best-selling book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, says, everything you want is on the other side of fear. Everything you want is on the other side of fear. The fear comes in many different forms. The fear I'm speaking to you all today about is a fear when you find yourself in a threatening situation. Typically, when you face someone or a group that has power or is perceived to have power over you. What happens when you're overwhelmed with that fear is that often we find ourselves withdrawing, physically or mentally, and those with power, take over that space. If you think about it, it happens every day in our world. In 2016, 1,000 ISIS fighters moved in and took over the southern Philippine town of Marawi. The backstory to this was that years ago, these ISIS fighters were a group of street thugs. They were selling guns and weapons, and they had moved into this town and began recruiting young boys from this town. The people in Marawi were too afraid of them and never spoke against them. So they just became more powerful till they aligned themselves with ISIS. The result of them taking over is that it took several months for the military to push them out. It was a fierce ground campaign that took the lives of 168 soldiers. 86 civilians were killed. The entire town of Marawi was leveled. A general told me afterwards that if somebody had just been courageous enough to tell the military or the police about the situation a few days earlier, all of this could likely have been avoided. How much do our fears shape who we ultimately become? So how do we overcome fear? How do we find the courage? It's definitely not easy, because courage costs. When we were looking at the mistreatment of refugees at the hands of those at the UNHCR and the Malaysian government, some refugees came forward and said, we want to help. We want to help expose what's going on. When we published our story, their lives are threatened. One of them gave me a frantic call on the phone saying, Steve, I'm being chased through the market, not too far away from here. Eventually, they caught up with him and severely beat him. I've had others I've done stories on killed for standing up for what they believe in. Cheng Guangcheng, a blind lawyer, stood up and tried to stop the forced abortions instituted by the local government in China. The result, he too was severely beaten. He was jailed for 4 years and suffered horrifically in jail for standing up. Afterwards, when he was released, he was subjected to house arrest with his wife. He had no means to make money. Every time we tried as media to get close to him, thugs in black t-shirts would take rocks and throw them at us and keep us away. Eventually, he and his wife had to escape to the US for sanctuary. He had to leave his beloved homeland. Courage costs. So, how do we face our fears? What I've learned from Cheng Guangcheng and others is that it takes a conscious effort. You need to spend the time to acknowledge the fear and then step by step find ways to face it. It sounds easier than it is, but these people have done it. And it is a step-by-step process. There's no miraculous formula that gives you courage overnight. You can't just pop a can of spinach like Popeye and get superhuman strength. It just doesn't happen. It's conscious and it's learned. And science supports this. What researchers have discovered is that fear registers in a part of our brain known as the amygdala. From there, the amygdala sends a signal to another part of the brain to tell our body how to react to what we're afraid of. Typically, it's fight or flight. What researchers have discovered also is that our natural proclivity is to hightail it out of there when we have a threat. That's our natural instinct. And the more often we do that, the deeper this neural pathway becomes, and the more ready we are to run away every time we face a threat. But researchers have also discovered that the exact opposite is true. If we choose to fight, the amygdala develops a new neural pathway. And the more often we choose to stand up for what we believe in, that neural pathway deepens, meaning that we can rewire our brain. We can unlearn fear. So how much do our fears shape who we ultimately become? The answer is only as much as we allow it to. In Nepal, there's one of the most remote regions in the world. It's known as Upper Mustang. It's in the shadow of the Himalayas. It has one of the richest Tibetan cultures. But thieves know that as well. And so over the last several years, they've been stealing religious statues and religious valuable items from the monasteries there. One man, though, who was a young boy at the time, Tashi Bista, decided that he wanted to stop this. And here's where I get to the step-by-step part. But when he wanted to stop it, he had no standing in the community. No one would listen to him. So what he did was, he first joined a group that was working to preserve the culture in Upper Mustang. After that, he began inviting documentary crews to do historical stories about the beautiful culture there that has existed for centuries. Once he had a standing as someone in the community that was trying to preserve culture, he then came to us and said, "This is what's happening in my community. These thieves are stealing from us. They're stealing our gods. Can we do something about it?" We launched an undercover investigation, and working with authorities in Nepal and working with Tashi, we managed to catch the biggest illegal antiquities dealer that was selling these religious statues, these gods, for hundreds of thousands of dollars overseas to private collectors and museums around the world. He was put in jail. Dozens of these priceless artifacts were retrieved. Back in Marawi, there was one person who stood up to the street gangs. His name was Saddam Makabando. When the street gangs moved in, he was in charge of his street, and he said, "No way are you guys coming in here to sell your guns and drugs. No way are you going to recruit the young boys from my street. Back off." When these gangs turned to ISIS and began beheading Christians, he, a Muslim, said, "This is wrong." he ran to his Christian neighbors and said, come hide in my house. I'll protect you. When the ISIS fighters began searching the neighborhood, they banged on his door. And they ordered him to allow them to go in to search his house. He blocked the way. And because he had stood up to them before, they backed down. As the aerial bombardment from the military increased, and as they were running out of food, Makabando went to the ISIS leaders and said, will you allow my family safe passage out of the war zone? And they amazingly said yes. But when the fighters saw all these people getting out, they said to him, who are these people? This is not your family. He put himself and his family in between the fighters and the Christians, and he walked them out to safety. 70 people were saved that day, and all because he stood up to them. He overcame his fears. I asked him later, were you not afraid? He said, sure, but it was the right thing to do. Society teaches us to keep our head down, to seek comfort, safety, to look after ourselves, to not get into complicated situations. But Makabando says, I never worried about all those big things. I just looked at the challenge in front of me and did the right thing. Small, slow steps. This is where I get personal. When I was a child, I was gripped by fear. I would often hide in the closet when my dad abused my mom. It got so bad that he sent her to hospital. Years later, after she had gotten out, I still lived with a sense of failure for not standing up for my mom, for not telling others what was happening. But I also realized I could not let it own me. So I just dedicated my life to seeking justice, to exposing wrongdoing, which is why I ended up in journalism. In Afghanistan, in that armored vehicle, I asked myself, am I going to allow fear to own me? I said no.
The remains of the suicide bomber's minivan continues to smolder. His body lies close by.
This is a short clip of the story I ran that night once I stepped out of that armored vehicle.
This military truck the hardest. It was in the center of the convoy. You can see where the shrapnel tore.
Did fear leave me that day I chose to stand up? No. But each time I chose to face my fears, I can tell you it got easier. What fears are you facing today? What injustices do you see out there but are still too afraid to speak out about? Just remember, you can unlearn your fear.